Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment videos. I'm Jim Boyce, and today we're going to be talking about what is efficiency. There are two senses in which the term efficiency is used. The sense that's most widespread, used in day-to-day speech, is cost effectiveness. Efficiency is about the lowest cost way to get from point A to point B. In other words, it's about the choice of the means for achieving our goals. The second meaning of efficiency, the one that's used by neoclassical economists, is more ambitious than that. It's not just about how to get from A to B most cost effectively. It's about how to decide where we want to go to begin with. It's about the choice of the ends. And it proposes that we should decide those ends, including the ends of environmental policy, by weighing up costs against benefits. Today, I want to talk with you about how that could be done or is done. The utilitarians, the classical economists of the 19th century, had a very clear, specific way of understanding what costs and benefits were about, based on what they thought human well-being was about. It was about something they called utility. Utility was the measure of individual well-being. And social welfare, adding up the well-being of everybody together, was simply adding up the sum of individual utilities. So for the utilitarians, what was efficient meant what would maximize total social welfare, the total sum of individual utilities. That was the utilitarian classical notion of efficiency. When you combine that notion with another proposition that entered into economics later in the 19th century, the notion of the diminishing marginal utility of income, the notion that as a person gets more and more dollars, the extra utility bang that they get for the buck diminishes, that a dollar's worth less to a millionaire than it is to somebody who has a middling income, let alone somebody living below the poverty line. That notion of the diminishing marginal utility of income, the extra utility you get from another dollar, shown in this graph, where marginal utility is on the vertical axis, and as you get more and more income, the extra bang you get for the buck goes down. Could also be shown in this graph, which shows total utility on the vertical axis and shows that as you have more income, your utility goes up, but goes up at a diminishing rate because the marginal bang you get for that buck diminishes. That notion, combined with the utilitarian notion of social welfare, the sum total of individual utilities, posed a dilemma. Because what happens when you combine those two propositions? That social welfare is the sum of everybody's individual utility, and that the bang, the utility bang you get for a buck, diminishes as you get more bucks. You put those together, and the prescription that emerges is that efficiency, in that classical sense, requires an equal distribution of income. If I get more utility from a buck than you do, then transferring some of your bucks to me would increase the sum total of utility, and vice versa. If you get more utility from a buck than I do, we should transfer from me to you in order to increase the sum total of utility, the sum total of welfare. So that provoked something of a dilemma for classical economists, because it was a pretty radical prescription, and frankly, most economists aren't totally comfortable making radical recommendations like we should have an equal distribution of income around the world to maximize social welfare. So neoclassical economics grappled with this dilemma, and they came up with a different definition of efficiency, a way that got them out of that problem posed by combining the utilitarian notion of social welfare with the diminishing marginal utility of income. And the solution had two steps. The first, in theory at least, was to drop the utilitarian social welfare function by abandoning interpersonal comparisons of utility, by saying, you know, I can't say whether I get more utility bang from a buck than you do, even though I'm a millionaire and you're poor. You can't say either. Maybe I really get a lot out of my extra dollars and you don't get so much. So that would be a value judgment to say who gets how much utility from a dollar. All we can say is that any individual gets less utility utility from the next dollar than from their last one, but we can't compare across people. So we can't add up utility across people. That was the first step, and that resulted in the concept, which some of you will have encountered if you've ever taken an introductory economics course, called Pareto efficiency. The notion that we can only describe something as an efficiency gain if somebody's made better off and no one is made worse off. Otherwise, it's not what's called a Pareto improvement. The second step involved the following. If Pareto efficiency was the only basis on which economists could recommend doing this instead of doing that, they wouldn't be able to recommend very much, because in the real world, there aren't really many ways to make somebody better off or everybody better off without making some people worse off. If you're going to protect the environment, that may help a lot of people, but certain people who are profiting or benefiting from being able to degrade the environment at no cost get made worse off when you try to protect the environment. So the second step that the neoclassical economists came up with was something called a compensation test. And the idea was that if the winners, if those made better off by a social decision, could compensate the losers, those made worse off, and still be better off themselves, it's what's called a potential Pareto improvement. So potentially, the winners could compensate the losers, and nobody would be worse off, and some people would be better off. So in theory, what efficiency means to the neoclassical economist is Pareto optimality, but in practice, what it means is weighing up the costs and benefits and seeing if the benefits exceed the costs, thereby implying that the winners could compensate the losers and still be better off. So cost-benefit analysis takes a different measure of social welfare from that of the old utilitarians. It doesn't add up utility across individuals, it adds up income or net benefits across individuals. And it recommends maximizing not the sum of total utility, but the sum of individual dollars. That's the basis for deciding what is better and what is worse. A bigger dollar pie is better. All dollars are valued the same, regardless of to whom they accrue. So if we look at two pies, one a bigger pie, one a smaller pie, that are divided between two parties, A and B, as shown in this picture, in the smaller pie, A actually has more than, B has more than B has in the big pie. The bigger pie disproportionately benefits A and actually harms B. Which pie is efficient? Well, by the Pareto criterion, you'd say you can't judge between them because, A's better off with the big pie, but B's worse off with the big pie. But if you use the neoclassical notion of efficiency as translated through the compensation test into benefit cost analysis, you'd say, oh, well, the bigger pie is more efficient because A could in principle compensate B and still be better off. Neoclassical efficiency means picking the bigger dollar pie, regardless of how it's sliced. So in theory, neoclassical economics dropped aggregation of welfare, aggregation of utility across individuals while retaining the diminishing marginal utility of income. But in practice, neoclassical economics retained aggregation across individuals, but aggregates income instead of aggregating utility, in effect disregarding the diminishing marginal utility of income, disregarding the possibility that dollars are worth more to people with less of them than they're worth to people with lots of them. So let's try to translate all that theory into practice to wrap up. Say we're asking the question, what is an efficient place to dump trash? And we're using the neoclassical efficiency criterion to make that decision. Well, we're going to weigh up the benefits and the cost. The benefit is you're getting rid of all this trash, which has to go somewhere. You got to do something with it. The cost is the damage imposed to the people for whom that trash degrades their immediate environment. Here's the logic of cost-benefit analysis put in very frank and, as a result, rather controversial terms. The measurement of the costs of health-impairing and pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity, that means people getting sick, and mortality, that means people dying. From this point of view, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic of dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest waged country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. You can imagine that when it's put that way, some people would be a little bit outraged by the proposition that just because you're poor, you deserve to have the waste dumped on top of you. That statement appeared in a memorandum, an internal memorandum of the World Bank. The author, or the person who signed it anyway, being the economist Lawrence Summers, who was the chief economist at the time. And the memo was leaked and published in The Economist magazine back in 1992 under the heading, "Let Them Eat Pollution." Personally, I think Summers did us a favor by laying out that logic so clearly in his memo, because what he was saying here was something that may sound outrageous to some folks, but in fact it simply is an explanation of the basis on which the neoclassical concept of efficiency as a basis for setting environmental policy is founded. And if you don't agree with the idea that the most efficient place to dump a load of toxic waste is the lowest wage country, then what that suggests is that the criteria that you're using to decide environmental goals is not just quote unquote efficiency, not just creating the biggest dollar pie, but has to do with other things like safety, sustainability, and justice.